for example, the clearest one is we could have on Tuesday, we could have said, well, this group got 7 votes, these 2 groups each got 6 votes, and I think, was that it? Does anyone remember?
The swing vote was 7, right?
Oh, yeah. Right, so it was 6.5 votes versus 5.5 votes. I don't know. It was 7 votes, 5.5, 5.5, and then 4. Was it something like that? Anyway, one system that makes sense is you take the 4-vote candidate and they go away. Or that option goes away, so now you have a runoff election between the top 3 vote getters, especially since 2 of the groups tied for second. So now there's a new vote. And then you get the top 2 winners, and then you vote again. So you have a series of runoff elections. And each time you have a new debate because there's a new set of competitors. The chemistry changes. And the arguments that each group would make would change in order to eke out a strategic advantage over the other 2 competitors. You see how that would work? So it would be a much more complex system. There's more than one kind of democracy. I mean, Americans especially tend to think that democracy is democracy is democracy. There's only one kind of democracy, and it's our democracy. But that's kind of crazy. Some groups do things by consensus. Consensus is an alternative mechanism for voting. And it doesn't mean everyone agrees. It just is a different process. There are different steps you go through, and people see the way the will of the group is moving, and they step aside at different points in the discussion until you basically tire everyone out and no one's willing to object anymore, and then we call that consensus. So it has its own benefits, its own both pros and cons. I can tell you, I've done consensus a great deal in my career. But some people are very optimistic about consensus and other democratic processes in doing a much better job at truly representing the will of a group of people. But basically, this boils down to games. There are sets of rules, and there's a structure, there's a sequence of procedures, and it yields an expected outcome, and it unfolds according to the rules. So it's an awful lot like a game. So the political process displays many of the attributes of games. And so out of cybernetics came another thing which we call game theory. The topic for next week is games people play. In a way, it's a very simple topic, as you'll see in the first 3 minutes of when I get to the main part of the lecture. It's a very simple idea about games and incentives and motivations, and it's so familiar. Anyone who's ever played a video game or, I don't know, been in school and done something because your grade depends on it, if you've ever done that, you understand how games work. The thing that makes it important to sprint a little bit at this moment in the class is that there is something very interesting coming up in architecture and urbanism in terms of systems theory, reflexivity, and games, specifically video games. This book, Space Fighter, is the presentation of a video game. A video game, the proposal is that it should replace planning and the traditional design process. The traditional design methodology needs to be replaced by video games. It's not a normal thing to say, right? How often does your instructor say, no more drawing, get out your laptops, we're going to play video games? That's what these guys are saying. And so it's worth looking at just how crazy it is what they're saying, and to what extent is it inevitable It's not crazy at all. It's actually might be the key to solving a lot of problems. And the final and probably most important immediate reason why I want to give you a bit more material in lecture today is because the reading from this book you will find to be quite challenging. And so I want to try to prepare you a bit to understand the key points as they come up in the reading by Ari Grafland, and also to encourage you to ignore other points. So things that you encounter in the reading this weekend that resonates with what I'm presenting in the lecture, that's probably a good place to buckle in and read it a few times, make sure you get it. And things that seem to be kind of out in low Earth orbit, kind of unrelated to what I'm presenting here, that's probably a good sign that you should ignore that. I might even go so far as to offer my suggestions in the reading before I post it as to what I think you should focus in on and what you can let slide. But I do recommend you read the whole thing because this is one of the better things I've ever read on this topic. And it resonates in an uncanny, kind of creepy way with what I wrote a few years ago that was the first reading for the class. We're referring to a lot of the same things in different ways, but it kind of confirms that we're not the only ones looking into these issues in architecture. And some people think that there are really big changes about to happen in the world, in the way architects and urbanists engage in the world, and what design methods work moving forward. What new design methodologies are now becoming available to us out of left field. Who'd have thought video games would be the next drawing? So that's my provocation for this lecture. And we're still on that. That's good. So, and then one other reason I thought of for doing this, and that explains some of the content of this lecture, is that there are certain issues that are starting to pop up in your term projects that help me realize that I haven't really given you a complete enough framework of the world, in a way, and what the design world is heading into, what problems designers are being asked to address in the 21st century compared with the 20th century, and how we're addressing them. And so I wanted to cover some of the bigger picture things like planetary death and population growth. And it's Charlie's fault, because he's the one who brought up population and density. So you can blame him. But if he didn't do it, someone else would. So I'm just going to cover this quickly. Okay. So the world of cybernetic systems, you will recall, is all about having feedback loops. And in a way, the story of the 20th century, the first modernity, in contrast with the 21st century, second modernity, is that architects like Corbusier envisioned the world and said, here's how the world should be, and then we tried to build it. And any problems that emerged out of this process was simply you needed to do it again, and you needed to do it more. You didn't complete the project. You didn't do everything I told you to do. Go back there and separate the functions a little bit more. And that's the typical response of the 20th century designer to problems, is we need more of the same. We need more technology. We need to do it more. We need more planning. We need more design in the same old way. But cybernetics identifies, and engineering systems in general, our understanding of systems, our understanding of biological systems, is the reason they work so well is because there's a feedback loop that when something goes wrong, that information of what went wrong and why goes back here and informs the next generation of input. So incrementally, things get better and better and better if you're doing this properly. If the feedback loops are in place, everything works. And you've experienced that enough in your own life, including traffic situations. When things don't work, you get hurt or you die, and then it's like Darwinian evolution. Really bad drivers win the Darwin Award, and they're no longer around to drive badly, in a very extreme example, right? Everybody knows about the Darwin Award. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Now, this idea of cybernetics back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of people thought this was going to be at the forefront of education, all kinds of education, especially design education. But it didn't turn out so much that way. What happened was it took off and transformed the business world. So this idea, and especially the business world in Japan, so rebuilding the Japanese economy after World War II, they came under very profound influence of these ideas of cybernetics. In Detroit, the designers design the cars, and you send that design into the system, and the car comes out, whatever the car comes out, that's the way it comes out. And that's it, we're done. They either sell or they don't sell. But in Japan, the car comes out, they test it to see what's working or not working, and then they take that information, they feed it back in. And this should sound familiar from the cybernetics readings. And so in Japan, they developed what they called the Kaizen system. And another term is total quality improvement. There's a lot of pretty nauseating catchphrases that come out of this. If you've ever worked in a professional firm, a business, if you've ever worked in a corporation or a business, you're going to have run into this. It's actually quite stunning that Wentworth, as an employer, as a business, is still living in 1950s Detroit. Whereas Northeastern, Harvard, MIT, every other school around here has some kind of total quality improvement, constant reevaluate how it's working, feedback loops. That's, it is part of the cybernetics revolution in business. But Wentworth still has kind of this feudal, I'm the boss, you do what I tell you, I don't want any feedback. But the rest of the world kind of has gone through this. And this is the world we live in. It's the Kaizen. Now, I'm going to make a leap here. There's so many different things we could look at. I'm going to, game theory. This is where I say something about game theory. And one of the most famous examples of game theory is mutually assured destruction of nuclear powers. The United States during the Cold War has had nuclear missiles. The Soviet Union during the Cold War had nuclear missiles. And we were at war with each other. It was a Cold War. The reason it was a Cold War is we both had nuclear missiles. We could not afford to have a hot war. And we had radars. We had feedback loops. If Soviet Union launched a missile at Washington, D.C., we would know it. We would know about that in time to launch our missile at Moscow. So there's an incentive not to launch a missile at each other's capitals, because as soon as you do that, we basically said to the Soviet Union, if we detect a nuclear missile on way towards our country, we will destroy your nation. We will send you into a nuclear winter. We have enough nuclear warheads to destroy every life on the planet 3 or 4 times over. And that was something we were proud of. We spent a lot of money to achieve that, which is ironic given global warming issues now. So that was a mutually assured destruction game. I'm not going to launch first because I don't want them to launch second. And so it's a game theory matrix. And so as long as that game theory was in place, we were fine. Now there are other games going on as well. Buckminster Fuller, do you know him? I know Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller is best known as the inventor of the geodesic dome. The one in Montreal, Epcot Center. But he was also a visionary architect and systems thinker. He came up through the cybernetics understanding. He came up through game theory. He was the first man to really say, listen, the Earth is like a spaceship. He came up with the term spaceship Earth. He and Barbara Ward, I'm not sure who came up with it first. But the Earth is like a spaceship. It is a finite system. It is not an endless batch of resources. We will run out someday. If we can model it and apply game theory to it, we can figure out what to do. So here's what he did. After World War II, he made the largest map of the world ever. And it was basically a model of the planetary system. He had a way of modeling economic systems of nations, resources, imports, exports, human resources, populations, pollution, war, everything. And he used his geodesic dome geometry of the icosahedron to make the most precise modeling of a sphere up to that point. No one had ever, the Mercator projection, Greenland looks like it's 3 times the size of Australia, when in fact, Australia is 3 times the size of Greenland. So he rationalized the modeling of the planet. Still, he put the United States smack dab in the middle, but it was World War II, right after World War II. So this is a playing out of the world game. And he did this for years in gymnasiums. It was the size of a basketball court. I feel very fortunate a few months before his death, I got to be part of the world game in Boulder, Colorado with Buckminster Fuller. It was like this. And you basically, by looking at the logical outcome, by modeling the sequence of decisions motivated by personal self-interest, you look at the logical outcome, and when you see the consequences of your personal decisions, it has an influence on those decisions. Now, this is a classic fundamental principle of system management. And it deserves to influence the decisions we make. And the 0.5% of the human beings on the planet who seem to take global warming seriously enough to let that influence their decisions, it's very frustrating because it should influence everybody's decision, right? But it's not. Is it going to? Well, that's a question that has been asked with Buckminster Fuller. Governments asked him to come up with a set of reports about what should happen. So it was very rational. It was basically a planning document. You look at you model the planet in all its systems, human and natural, and then you test different scenarios to see what are the most likely outcomes given a certain set of assumptions. And you can draw conclusions about what is going to happen in the future. You can predict the future, and based on those predictions and the relationship between the assumptions and the outcomes, you can then say, I don't like that outcome. Planetary death is not a good outcome. Let's change the assumptions. Let's change the basis upon which we make our decisions to see if we can come up with a better outcome. Now, in effect, this is almost exactly the same description of what Buckminster Fuller was doing in the 1950s and 60s, and what MVRDV talked about very briefly about 4 years ago. I'm not sure they're doing anything with this anymore, but even if they never pick up the ball, someone is going to pick up the ball. And we will be modeling the planet and all its systems identifying assumptions based on the patterns of human behaviors and choices we make, and testing to see what the likely outcomes of those choices are, judging those outcomes, and then trying somehow to use that modeling to change the assumptions, change our choices to try to come up with better outcomes. Outcomes that do not involve widespread extinction of species, including the human species. And so it's the same instinct, the same parameters. This is still happening. And here you see some of the resources that are being modeled on this map. SimCity, a harmless, pointless game. Or is it? Well, it is. But what could it be? What if you had a more sophisticated version of SimCity that was informed by the motivations and the serious job of Buckminster Fuller's World Game? And here we have a Dymaxion map now updated with Google Earth satellite imagery. The thing that was really amazing about Buckminster Fuller's World Game is that I could walk from Colorado to New York. And it's like this. There's Colorado, here's New York. And then I could go over the North Pole and end up in the Soviet Union and realize how close we are. But it was like, there's the Soviet, and there's something about walking on the planet as if you're a giant that is remarkable in terms of changing your perspective. If you multiply that by some very large number, you get this revolutionary access and viewpoint of the planet through Google Earth. And one of my favorite things to do is to just get the Earth spinning below my Google Earth screen and just watch the landscape go by, like I'm flying over it. Actually, I'm about to fly over it. It'll take about 80 hours of flying for me to get away from here and get back here, so it doesn't sound so appealing anymore.
Where are you going?
Java. So, and then if you add to that virtual reality, it's a game changer, especially if you've ever read anything about the importance of human spatial experience, which you have. So this entire thing about phenomenology and the power of human spatial experience, it all comes together when you go from abstract mapping that's out there, it's a flat image. Now when you get into the gaming environment and it's a 3D experiential environment, it has remarkable potential. So, who's this guy? His name is Jared Diamond. Do you know who Jared Diamond is? He had a TV show called Guns and a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. He basically said, guns, germs, and steel, and a few other things, these are the basis for why some societies prospered, flourished, became dominant on the planet, and others have remained in the Stone Age. And it was all triggered when one of these guys, one of his friends in Papua New Guinea, asked him, how come white people like you are so successful, and look at us? We barely have enough calories to make it through the day. How come you come here in an airplane and we go about in dugout canoes? And that's the question that Jared Diamond set out to answer. And somewhere along the way, he had this insight that resulted in the book Collapse. Have you heard of this book? It's one of the 3 or 4 most important books for politicians, at least, to read that have come out recently. Basically, he looked at places like Easter Island that were one of these super successful societies, but then they went extinct. They died out. How does that happen? How do you go from being the superstars of the neighborhood to basically dying out and disappearing? And so he looks through history and he comes up with several dozen examples of when this has happened before. Now the subtext, not so subtext, is this could happen to us. We are not so high and mighty that we can't fail and fall and disappear. It's happened before. And his favorite example is Easter Island. There it is. Easter Island, which is famous for, yes, the heads. Who does that? Who would do that? The only people who would do that is people who have a lot of time on their hands. The people, the guy who's teaching them how to hunt with a bow and arrow, he doesn't have time to do this. He's trying to get enough calories for himself and his family today so that he can earn the right to look for calories the next day and repeat that for tens of thousands of years. That's that guy. These guys had all the calories they needed and then some. They had enough surplus to waste, to squander their time on these heads. Now, why did they have all that surplus? It's because they were hugely successful. They had an inter-island trade network because they had very sophisticated navigation and big canoes that they could sail from island to island. So they engaged in inter-island trade. They had way more of something than what they needed, and they could trade it with other islands for things they couldn't otherwise have access to. And the way they could even move these heads is because they had big trees to construct scaffoldings and cranes to move these things. And they had a very sophisticated religious system, a very hierarchical society of extremely rich people and extremely poor slaves. And it was a very successful society in all the usual terms, in terms of economics and that type of thing. But what happened? They ended up using their trees for ships, using their trees for fuel, using their trees for buildings, using their trees for their heads. And what happens when you do that on an island? You run out of trees. And so Jared Diamond is otherwise a pretty sharp guy. But one of his favorite teaching moments when he teaches his class about Easter Island is he says to them, what do you think it felt like to be that guy, who's probably a guy, who cut down the last tree on Easter Island, thus dooming his society to extinction? And it wasn't a pretty extinction. They ended up eating each other, and it was horrible. So what did it feel like? What do you think it felt like? Let's pretend I'm Jared Diamond in your Jared Diamond's class. What does it feel like to be the last person, the person to cut down the last tree? And the class, typically it's the fool. He's an idiot. He was a criminal. They must have put him in jail. He was a vandal. He was probably some teenage guy who just was angry at his parents, right? This is the answer that Jared Diamond thinks is the right answer. He also thinks that if only someone was there to tell the people of Easter Island what was going to happen to them if they cut down their trees, then they wouldn't have done it, right? Does that make sense? Well, this is Jared Diamond's story. And the reason you sense that I don't agree is because it's a very convincing story, but it is so horribly wrong in such a destructive way. It's the difference. Jared Diamond is talking about the negative feedback loop. If they just knew that they depended on their trees, then they would maintain the trees and sustain them and make sure that they had long-term viability of their society. But instead, they didn't know that the trees were important, and so they cut them down as fast as they could until it became an untenable situation. Right? But what's wrong with this picture? Do you really think they couldn't tell? Do you really think that they're that stupid? Jared Diamond is famous for being a racist, also. Game theory to save the planet. There's a lot of this going on. And a few years ago in the community studio, we did one. We had a negotiation where it wasn't winner take all, it was a negotiation using design. It was very cool. But the adjunct professor who gave us that got on the wrong side of the administration. Now he can't teach there anymore. He can't teach her anymore. So reality is broken is this new book that Jane McGonigal. The reason I'm showing these things about game, the reason we're back in games is because game theory helps us understand what really happened in Easter Island. Jane McGonigal bumped her head and started losing her memory and started having mental problems. And she brought herself back through gaming. And now she is a gaming guru. There's a website that's on the resources tab of Blackboard if you ever are looking for ideas for a term project. You can explore those tabs. This is one of them, I believe. It's called Super Better. You can set a goal for yourself, and she sets up a game for you. And you can work to achieve certain incremental goals and give yourself an incentive system through this game theory idea to achieve whatever goal you're interested in achieving. And it's pretty convincing. So here we are, the game theory that I applied to the Jared Diamond Easter Island theory. I was looking at sushi. I love sushi. My kids love sushi. Sushi is the first food my daughter ever ate. And it wasn't because we gave it to her, it's because she demanded it when she was about 14 months old. So sushi is really popular, and the best sushi in the world is bluefin tuna. It's also the most expensive sushi in the world. It's so expensive, it's so valuable, that it's led to overfishing and a decline in the population numbers. The North Atlantic bluefin tuna, there's also a Pacific bluefin tuna, but this shows the spawning grounds of North Atlantic bluefin tuna. It's an international playing board of this game. And so it has to do with international treaties and fishing rights. It's a very tricky business. But there are regulations that control the amount of fishing you can do. And there are limits to how much bluefin tuna you can catch in order to protect the species, like many other species. But there's something about the value of the fish that pushes and tests those limits. As a matter of fact, there's a huge black market economy in bluefin tuna. It's almost as if the more regulation you put on limiting the catches of bluefin tuna, the more the price goes up, the more profitable it is to fish bluefin tuna, legally or not. Isn't that weird? If you make a law against something, it happens more. What does that sound like? What does it sound like?
Negative feedback.
It's tricky. A negative feedback loop gives you homeostasis. Positive feedback gives you supercritical explosions. But what examples does that sound like? Traffic? Yeah. The safer you make the road, the more accidents that happen. How about drug trafficking? Oh, look, there's that word traffic again. You make something illegal, it explodes. The number of establishments in Manhattan, in New York City, during Prohibition skyrocketed compared to a few years before. So as soon as Prohibition hit, it became so much more profitable to sell alcohol that the amount of alcohol consumed and the money made from the consumption of alcohol skyrocketed during Prohibition. Thus, the argument that many people have, and I'm not sure where I fall on this, and so don't make assumptions. A lot of people have argued if you want to reduce drug addictions, illegal drug addictions in the United States, legalize it and control the substance. Treat it like tobacco and alcohol. And you'll eliminate the drug cartels. You'll make the world a safer place. A new revenue stream for uh, for governments and societies, it's all good. Or is it? The Netherlands has been having some trouble with its legalized marijuana laws. But anyway, the point is that the way these things work is when you make a law against something, there are often unexpected consequences. Some of them can actually make the activity rise, not go down, because of the way economic systems work. Here's the president of Kiyokuma company cutting the head off of recently caught tuna, bluefin tuna. Every year, typically in January, February, there's a new headline, and it's been true every year I've been tracking this. Tuna sold at auction for $86,000, a single tuna. That was 2003. Next year, tuna sold at auction, breaking all records, $94,000 for one fish. And it goes on and on. I just checked this morning. In January of this year, a fish like this was sold at auction for $736,000. One little piece of sushi from that is $96. Boy, I bet that tastes good. So here you are. You're the fisherman. Look at that smile. You're the fisherman on the boat. And Jared Diamond's on the boat with you. Jerry, how's it going? You here to help us catch fish? No. I'm here to tell you that the bluefin tuna is at risk of going extinct. As a matter of fact, I believe that the last bluefin tuna in the world, see, it's like the tree in Easter Island, the last bluefin tuna in the world is swimming off right over there. Where? Where, Jerry? Where? Right there. See, it's right there. But I'm telling you, if you catch this fish, there will be no more bluefin tuna. Where? What fish? I don't see it. No, I'm telling you, that's the last one. If you catch it, I don't see it. It's right there. Okay, swing it around. And okay, another scenario. Oh, really? You mean that's the last fish? Oh. Let's not catch it. So the next guy comes up. He says, hey, what are you guys talking about? Oh, it's the last bluefin tuna fish. And if we catch it, they'll go extinct. And you know what he says? Where? Where is it? So Jared Diamond might convince the fisherman who's about to pull that fish, that last fish out of the water, he might convince him not to take that fish out. But it doesn't matter, because look behind that guy. He's not going to pull it out. He's going to step back. But if you look behind that fisherman, there is a line stretching around the globe of people waiting for the opportunity to pull that fish out of the water, because it means, I can retire. I can buy my own boat. My children will go to college. Their grandchildren will go to college. I will be the wealthiest person in my country if I pull the last, because how much is the last bluefin tuna worth? A lot more than $736,000. It's priceless. So I think, with all due respect, Professor Diamond, I think that the person who cut down the last tree on Easter Island was not some thug, some vandal. I think he was the king. I think he was the most powerful person on Easter Island. As a matter of fact, he could have killed several people for the right to cut down that last tree, because that makes him the most important, wealthiest person on the island. So it doesn't matter, because of the situation surrounding the fish, it doesn't matter what story you tell them. That last fish is as good as gone, because the system, the forces operating within the system in terms of incentives in a game theory analysis, guarantees that that fish is out of here. Does that make sense? And so that's the value of game theory. What else operates in that way? Economics works in terms of the profit incentive. Whoever harvests the most resources from the commons, in this case the oceans, so you remember the tragedy of the commons, whoever has the most cows on the commons gets the most profit from those cows, from that commons. They also contribute the most to the degradation of the resource, but that's everybody's resource. I disproportionately benefit. I share the same degradation of resources that everybody else shares, but I harvest vastly more profits than anybody else. So do I make the decision to harvest those resources? You're damn right I do, because if I don't, there's a line of other people who are going to do it instead of me. So it doesn't matter if it's me or any of those thousands of other people standing in line behind me, that resource is as good as gone. When you write the rules, whoever takes the most out of the system the fastest wins. The system will be depleted very quickly. And that's the way we've written the rules. So this is what happens when the black market comes in. Now, there are certain assumptions. Adam Smith famously said, people make decisions according to their own self-interest. And we are rational decision makers. We will do things that are in our own self-interest. If it is not in our self-interest to have all the bluefin tuna disappear from the oceans, then we will choose not to have sushi. We'll choose not to have bluefin tuna sushi. Is that true? Apparently, it is not true, and it's not true in a significant way. And this is the newest development in the field of economics. It's not really economics, but economists thought of it, so they're calling it economics. They're calling it behavioral economics. Have you heard of behavioral economics? It's the new hot thing. President Obama is the first, might even be the first government official in the United States to have an advisor who is a behavioral economist. Behavioral economics acknowledges that we don't always make the decisions that are the most rational decisions in our own self-interest. Sometimes we choose this or that depending on what's convenient and what is easy, or what's the default setting, right? How many of you have gone into Microsoft Word and changed the autocorrection settings? I have. Is there anybody else? But most people don't. The default setting, so says the advisor to President Obama, it's very important what you make the default setting. And you can alter the outcome of people's decisions by setting up default settings in a certain way, as demonstrated by my favorite economic philosopher, Homer Simpson. He came in for a donut, but it's all the way over there. And here are these healthy fruits. I think I'll have a healthy fruit. There are several books that came up. Predictably Irrational demonstrates that we can actually make irrational choices in very predictable ways. And Nudge, Cass Sunstein is President Obama's advisor on behavioral economics. It shows that if you structure the decision space in a certain way, and these are my terms, if you structure the process, the conditions of the decision in specific ways, it will lead to certain outcomes over others. Okay. Here's the population thing. That brings us to the population thing. Some of you might think that we have a population problem, and we do. But that's trivial compared to our consumption problem. And so we're going to do this very quickly. For most of human history, the global population was very low, 10 million, 100 million. All of a sudden, in the last 2,000 years, we suddenly broke through the 100 million mark of global population. And zoom, in a wink of an eye, in merely 2,000 years, we hit 1 billion people. And about the time we hit 1 billion people, Thomas Malthus, an amateur mathematician, said, hey, hold on, warning. Our ability to increase the food supply increases incrementally, but population increases exponentially. If a woman has 4 children, well, you took 2 semesters of math. The difference between exponential and incremental is significant. At some point, the lines will cross. It's inevitable. And so, also a racist, he said, we have to make sure poor people and minorities get sterilized in order to avoid this. At least he had a response, but what did we do? Nothing. Not a thing. And so, what happens next? In order to see it, it happens so fast. In order to see it, we have to compress the scale. So what had been, 12,000 years of history, the first 10,000 years of history is here, and then this is the last 2,000 years, and we start looking at it. So it's a very distorted scale, just so we can see it, see how fast it happens. We hit 2 billion in 130 years after that. We hit 3 billion in 30 years after that. We hit 4 billion. Okay, when we hit 3 billion, we were worried about nuclear. In 1960, we were worried about nuclear annihilation. These are the missiles crossing the ice cap on their way to destroy both countries. Dr. Strangelove. So it only took 13 years, or 16 years, to get to 4 billion. And we had the first pictures of the planet Earth from space and got a sense of the spaceship Earth and its limited resources. Now it only took 13 years to hit 5 billion. And where's this going? We're doomed, right? We're going to be, as a planet, we are like Easter Island. We are going to end up eating each other just to survive. Don't worry. Everything's going to be fine. In terms of population, everything's going to be fine. Okay? But because of our economic system, we learned how to make money sucking whatever assets were in that planet really quickly out of the Earth. So we hit, where are we at? 6 billion at year 2000. And this happens. We're starting to eat each other. It looks like we're about to eat each other. Resource warfare. We're going to war just to control oil flow. And so we recently hit 7 billion, 3 or 4 weeks ago. Congratulations. We made it so far so good. Not bad. Thomas Malthus never would have dreamed this was possible. But it turns out that capitalism and technological innovation has kept up with the demand. The profit incentive is a miracle reflexive mechanism. If you can make money at it, supply and demand, if it starts to get scarce, the price goes up, and so we harvest more resources. We have harvested the resources of the planet so quickly that millions of years of resource accumulation, if it's a system, the only inputs are sunlight and a little bit of meteorite dust and the gravitational pull of the moon. But in terms of the system, those are the only inputs we have. The rest is the original asset of a bunch of chemicals and rock and molten metals, and that's it. That's the only inputs the system has. There ain't nothing coming in other than that. Until we start mining the asteroids, that's all it is. But we have taken millions of years of accumulated mainly sunlight and harvested it out of the earth in the form of fossil fuels. How long does it take to make fossil fuels from sunlight to gas in the pump? I know, a long time. How many? Millions. Big time. So we are sucking these resources out of the planet faster than they are reaccumulating. That's why they're called non-renewable resources. And where's the population going fastest? Not in the developed world. Population is growing in the developing world faster than any place else. And so it's predictable, 2025, we're going to hit 8 million. And this is the increase since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution of carbon injected into the atmosphere. Here we are, 2006 or so, and this is 32 years. Each square is 1 year's worth of carbon emissions into the atmosphere beyond what the Earth can handle. And so it's accumulating faster and faster. And so 2030, we hit 8 billion. And, you know, it's just going to keep going, right? No, it's not. What's happening? 2050, we hit 9 billion. But what's happening? It took longer. It took longer. We don't have time to talk about why. But the global population is predicted. Actually, it's pretty well known because the mothers of all these children and the grandmothers of all these children have already been born. So we know how many mothers and grandmothers there are going to be. We have a pretty good sense. And depending on there's very little that can alter this. But basically, it has to do with the development, the demographic transition of urbanization. So basically, the thing that saved us is urbanization and economic development. We go back to the regular scale, and what we see here is a really long period of time where there were 10 to 100 million people in the world. And then we hit the wall, and in the flash of an eye, we shoot from 10 million to 10 billion. And where does it go from here? We are now a 10 billion person world. So we might as well just assume, for the sake of planning, 10 billion people. Phew. We can handle 10 billion, right? We're already at 7. What's 3 billion measly more people? They're all going to live in the slums of the developing world anyway. But wait, if you were going to look at the equation, we're back to math. It's the number of people times the per capita consumption of those people. Equals how many Earths do you need? So we only have one. So this is fixed. And this is pretty much fixed now. That's 10 billion. I've never written it this way. That's pretty good. So that tells us how many fractions of global assets each of us are allowed to consume in a year, because this is a time thing. But in 1985, we crossed the line. Up until 1985, we had not yet surpassed the carrying capacity of the planet. But now we blew it. We've surpassed the carrying capacity, and we're heading in this direction. The World Wildlife Fund, they're so sweet. They're so happy. They're such happy people. Look, they think this is what's going to happen. They don't know the story of the bluefin tuna. That's not what happens, World Wildlife Fund people, my friends. This is what happens. And that's what it looks like.
That was good timing.
Good timing, huh? So every time I give this lecture, who's that?
Is that Rolf?
Ralph, get out of my Ralph. Get out of my screen. Oh, that's a bad association. Sorry, Ralph. Okay. It's okay. Everything's going to be all right. Okay. For now. So as my software recovers, this is the one I want. So, are you going to be okay? So, so now I've changed it. I changed this to look at this. How much have we actually been consuming per capita? I'm sorry to say, but that red line that is population, that's this red line. So I had to compress this. This is actually, if the per capita impact keeps increasing the way it has between 1970 and 2000. In that 30-year period, the per capita impact of each person, the average person on the planet, has doubled. If that process continues, and if anything, it's accelerating, look at China and India, they're starting to buy cars. So as the per capita impact of the average American, the average Earthling increases, you take that 10 billion, even if it sticks to 10 billion, if the consumption level keeps going up, the total impact goes through the roof. This makes, what's his name, former vice president, Al Gore's little lift thing look cute by comparison. This is much beyond the time frame he was looking at, and this takes into a lot more than just carbon. And so this is a very sobering thing. But the silver lining is, if you consume at a level of someone from the United Arab Emirates, hey, someone else is in the doghouse other than us. We're number 2. United Arab Emirates has now surpassed us in terms of their impact. Go United Arab Emirates. Take the pressure off of us. So this is the average, the global average of impact. And here's where the United States is. If everyone lived like an American, how many people could there be on the planet? 1 or 2 billion. That's it. That's the carrying capacity of the planet. This is an answer to the question, how many people can we have before we run out of things? The answer is, it depends. It depends on the impact. And the impact depends on the economic incentives for either maximizing the impact, as it is now, or altering the game, altering the rules of the game to create an incentive to reduce the environmental impact. If everyone lives like an American, and who doesn't want to? Did you see Baywatch? Did you see the TV? Do you see how those Americans live? They drive cars, they shoot each other. Who doesn't want to do that? It's cool. Do you see their cities? You see their country club? You see the swimming pool and the bikinis? Oh, forget about going to the mosque. I want some of that, right? Everyone in the world wants some of what we got, and that's what they're getting. They wake up in the morning, how can I get that? How can I get that? Every morning, how can I get that? And so they're trying their best. Look at China. They're about to surpass the United States in all kinds of ways, including the number of cars manufactured and bought. So everyone wants what we have. If they did 1 billion, 2 billion, that's all we can have. Sorry. If everyone lives like an Indian from India, 30 billion, no problem. Vegetarians, don't drive too much, no problem. 30 billion, easy. So how many people can the Earth support? It depends. Now, somebody has been living like this for a long time. Did you go to the Netherlands? Did I tell you about the flooding in the Netherlands? It seems like I have. And you've seen these slides. Good thing. Have you seen these slides? You've seen them. You've seen these? Okay. So you remember this? So I'm just reminding you that the scale and the quantity of the challenge is intimidating, but it's not impossible. It was over 1,000 years ago that the story the Dutch people were telling each other is very similar to the story I'm telling you. Listen, the sea's rising. There is no way we can continue to live in the Netherlands. Let's move out. And they said, no, no. We will be strangers in a strange land. Let's stay here. Let's make it work. Let's change our attitudes. Let's work together, create a polar environment, and let's work it out. So the Dutch have an approach that they developed out of necessity for decision making and an approach to solving problems together. And it has to do with game theory. So there was a competition. Did we talk about this competition? There was a piece of land that needed to be developed. It was it's about the size of the Wentworth campus. But the developers said, listen, we could develop it this way or that way. I'm open. Let's have a competition. The people designing the competition said, let's make it interesting. Let's assume that the choice we make for this small piece of land is the same choice everyone makes for all of the land of the Netherlands. And let's look at what the long-term implications are if everyone made this choice. And so this approach is called scenario testing, extreme scenario testing. So every architect who entered this competition, first they designed what they would do on this piece of land, and then they looked at what the impact would be if everyone did it. First they emptied out the green heart of the Randstad, the circle of cities, and they said, let's pretend that really is an agricultural open space. And now we're going to develop it for housing. What would it look like if we did the Achtkamp model for this piece of land and all the similar pieces of land? This is what it would look like. Now let's look at what would happen if we did the city of small steps. That's the white dots. That's the 1 kilometer radius around every regional train station. Now let's say if instead of small steps, it was the city of short bicycle rides. That's the 5 kilometer circle around every regional train station. The rest would become open space. It's like an urban growth boundary like they did in Oregon. And so every architect tested it. They said, what if it was developed to the density of Manhattan? What if it was developed at the density of these different paradigmatic models? And this scenario testing led the architecture firm MVRDV to do a studio at the Architectural Association in London that led to the book called FAR Max. I'm raising my hand because, yes, Professor Cowherd, I've heard of this book, FAR Max. Okay. Might be in the library, I don't know. But they basically did the most extreme scenario testing. They said, what if the entire population of the planet moved to a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer square, 1 kilometer high? That's, if back then when they first did it, it was 6 billion people in that cube of space. And they tested the scenario, and they looked at the quantity, and they did a visualization of the quantities of different things. And they did lots of graphics like this that led them to the next step, which was to replicate what Buckminster Fuller did with the world game. They made computer models that only allowed there to be 4 programmatic elements, and they have these cubes that are pixels. And they said, what if we wanted to maximize the diversity of uses? And then they set the parameters with sliders, and the computer generated this type of a form. And they said, what if we wanted to reduce the building height? Then the computer generates the algorithm that the computer is generated with generates forms like this. Or keep houses and the park, keep the parkland out of the shadows of the houses. It generates forms like this. Keeps commercial units available for expansion. And so the thing is, these are parameters. If you ask the question, what does parametric modeling do other than generate cool forms? Well, it depends on what parameters you're designing for. You can get the parametric modeling machinery to model whatever parameters you give it. If you have a spreadsheet of data, population, economic, income, anything you can put in a spreadsheet and can manipulate with a formula, you can optimize through changing the values of the different parameters. And so they went from architecture to urban design to regional design to things like this that are generated by computer modeling by altering the parameters. And when they took it to the logical extreme, they ended up with space fighter video game modeling. And it's based on the extreme scenarios. You make a decision about one specific site, the video game will say, okay, now you've given me an approach and a set of values. I'm going to automatically, cybernetically apply that logic to many other places around the planet. Let's look at what the outcome is. So it basically took that Alexanderplatz competition to its logical extreme, to the point where it's not just covering the Randstad of the Netherlands, but the entire planet. And so it allows you to take into consideration pollution, commercial labor wages, land prices, exploitation of people, innovations, communications, research. All of these things you thought it was safe to ignore because we're just architects. They have brought it back into the system. They have made specific links between those things and the form of public space. Some performance parameter of public space, like how many people live within 1 kilometer of that public space. That's a parameter that can be put in a spreadsheet. It can be optimized or de-optimized, and it can generate multiple different forms in an emergent, unpredictable fashion, as if out of a natural system, as if out of a biological system. And these connections can multiply to model extreme degrees of complexity that you don't even have to understand. The interesting thing is you move a slider, you make a design decision and you move a slider, and the output, which is extremely crude, and this is a big flaw, these are pixels, it's extremely crude, the outcome will change based on what you optimize, which parameters you optimize and which ones you de-emphasize. This is a modeling of Dubai and the Palms development off the coast of Dubai. And so it gives you a sense of the kinds of things. Now this is extremely crude given where we're at now. This was 4 years ago. I suspect they've abandoned this project as they should. And what they should do is they should do stuff like what Carlo Ratti's group at MIT is doing and what they're doing at Emerson College. Eric Gordon is doing modeling simulations where people can walk through as avatars through the environment and interact with each other in the manner of a video game, gaining points, losing points, depending on their success. And so the outcomes of these things are quite exciting because no one is designing the outcome. Well, the outcome gets designed eventually, but the rough outlines of the outcome are designed through a process. The process is being designed increasingly. It generates an outcome which is a density and distribution of attributes. That's where the architectural design starts, after you've established these parameters and optimized certain characteristics of it. That's where the architect takes over and starts to design how those things are resolved. It doesn't eliminate design, it complicates the design to the point where higher degrees of complexity are then possible. And I'm just showing you some of the images that are emerging out of these types of endeavors. Without getting into the details, in a way, that's your job. So that was a huge amount of area to cover. But what I'm hoping is it sets you up well, both for this reading and for your term projects, and for a stronger sense that this course is very much grounded in architectural practice of the 21st century. That this is what we're talking about. We're not the only ones talking about this. This is something that you will be encountering for the rest of your careers in one way or another. And it's not all going to be good. As a matter of fact, most of it will be bad. And so in a way, we're testing the waters of how do we judge this new stuff? Do we give it a pass? Do we say, oh, it's parametric, so go ahead, do whatever you want? Or do we still maintain a critical eye and judgment towards what is harmful and what is beneficial? And that's kind of as close as we're going to get to a conclusion.